All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Hello, my name is Henry Heng Lu. I'm the Executive Director and Curator of Center A, Vancouver International Center for Contemporary Asian Art. It's such an honor to invite David Garneau to speak to us today as part of Center A's inaugural Arts Writing Mentorship program. Before we begin, on behalf of Center A, I would like to acknowledge that Center A is situated on the unceded territories of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, on which we have the opportunity to create, learn, and live as uninvited guests. Unceded means that this land was never surrendered, relinquished, or handed over in any way. We recognize that the Indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed from homelands and territories upon which an institution was built and currently occupies and operates in. We encourage you to reflect on the history of the land that you're watching or streaming this from and the land's caretakers. Located in Vancouver's Chinatown Centre, also acknowledge and recognize the complex and multi-layered experiences of the individuals who have lived, built, and contributed to the vibrancy of this historic neighborhood, and those who continue to do so today. Center A's Arts Writing Mentorship program, it's a very unique opportunity for self-identifying Asian youth, those who also identify as emerging, whatever that means, young writers, poets, curators, editors, and also those who aspire to be working with text and also in the publishing industries. It's a 12-week program with two main mentors, Alan Cho, who's the who's the director of the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop Society, and also Bo Pache, who runs Our Speak, one of our most beloved artisan centers in Vancouver. During this 12-week program, we also invited a guest speaker for each week to speak about a range of perspectives, ideas, and also thoughts that are important and also essential to a lot of thinking around arts writing, and also how to work with texts and to write about arts, but also beyond. Anyway, David will give us a talk today, and then after that we'll have a Q&A, and then you will also have the opportunity to meet our cohort of mentees, 8 folks, and after that you are also welcome. For those who are not in the writings, the mentorship program, you're also welcome to submit your questions through the Q&A or the chat functions at the bottom of your screen. And also you'll be able to see subtitles if you click on more and then show subtitle. And there is also the function for showing the full transcript of today's program. Just wanted to let you know that there are those options over there. Wonderful. So without further ado, let me and my colleague Rachelle introduce David to everybody. David Garneau, Métis, is head of visual arts at the University of Regina. He is a painter, curator, and critical art writer interested in creative expressions of Indigenous contemporary ways of being. Garneau curated Kahwatsiretátie, the Contemporary Native Art Biennial in Montreal 2020, with assistance from Faye Mullen and Rudi aker, co-curated with Kathleen Ash Milby, Transformer Native Art in Light and Sound, National Museum of the American Indian, New York, in 2017 with Secrecy and Despatch with Tess Allas, an international exhibition about massacres of Indigenous people and memorialization for the Campbelltown Art Centre in Sydney, Australia in 2016. And moving forward, never forgetting with Michelle LaVallee, an exhibition concerning the legacies of Indian residential schools, other forms of aggressive assimilation and reconciliation at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina in 2015.
Recent essays include From Indian to Indigenous Temporary Pavilion to Sovereign Display Territories in Search of Expo 67, 2020, Electric Beads on Indigenous Digital Formalism, Visual Anthropology Review 2018, and Garneau has recently given keynotes in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and throughout Canada on issues such as misappropriation, reconciliation, public art, museum displays, and Indigenous contemporary art. His performance, Dear John, featuring the spirit of Louis Riel meeting with John A. Macdonald statues, was presented in Regina, Kingston, and Ottawa. David recently installed a large public artwork, the Tawatina Bridge paintings in Edmonton, and his paintings are in numerous public and private collections.
And welcome, David.
Hey.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Initially, I know that we sort of thought about doing this program in person, but I think that also connecting online today, it's sort of give us the opportunity to connect with a lot of folks who might not be able to join in person. But definitely we're welcome to you to Center next time when opportunities align in person. But yeah, welcome.
That's
and
terrific.
I'm gonna mute myself and then go to the behind the scenes.
Well, before you disappear, so I'm going to do a little bit of an extended land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to, is it possible then to meet the 8 people who are gathered around the table, just so they can, I'm going to ask them their name and 2 questions, and that will guide the talk. Is that possible?
Oh, sorry. Yes, yeah. Definitely.
Okay. So I'm speaking from Treaty 4, and I want to, because we are under treaties and I've grown up pretty much all my life on the plains, I want to explain the difference between that and the unceded territory that you occupy. So the numbered treaties are legal and sacred covenants between the Crown and the original inhabitants and stewards of the Great Plains and north central woodlands of the territory now known as Canada. The Crown is the legal name of the British government whose rights in this matter were transferred to Canada's Crown at Confederation. According to British law, Canada's legal existence depended upon securing written settlements with the people who were here first. Treaty 4, signed in 1874, is an agreement between, on one side, settlers, their heirs, and importantly in this conversation, anyone accepting the social contract of becoming a Canadian. And on the other side, people then known as Indians, a sort of collection of quite different nations. In this case, where I'm at in Regina, the Nehewak, also known as the Cree, Anishinaabeg, also known as the Saulteaux, and the Dakota, Lakota, and Dakota peoples. The spirit of the treaty is that in exchange for sharing their land, in exchange for sharing their land, First Nations people are compensated, have reserved lands, and special rights in perpetuity. Most importantly, elders understand that treaty is with the Creator, and it's a sacred obligation that includes or other than human relations. For Indigenous folks, the idea of title to land and its surrender is inconceivable. Treaty is an agreement to share responsibility. I also acknowledge that in addition to the treaty signatories that I mentioned earlier, this area is shared at various times by the Métis, Blackfoot, and ancient others. I recognize the elders, knowledge keepers, land protectors, and cultural producers, past and present. I'm Métis, a descendant of River Lot people, Eleanor and Laurent Garneau, who in 1872 moved from Red River to what is called Amesquachiwaskayagan, also known as Beaver Hills, also known as Edmonton, in Treaty 6, where I grew up. And I'm now, for the last 23 years, a grateful guest here in Oscana, also known as Regina, in Treaty 4. So as I mentioned to Henry, what I'd love to do, so I'm loaded for bear. I do have an essay that sort of falls apart at the end. I was overthinking this thing probably too much, and it might be too junior for this crowd, but there's some little nuggets that I could pull out. And then I've got a more general model that I would like to describe in terms of what guides my art writing, kind of in a nerdy way. It's less of a philosophical thing than a very practical guide. And depending on your interests, I can pick and choose from those two different categories. And how I'd like to do that is get to know you and what you're up to. So if you wouldn't mind, I would like to go through the participants, the 8 participants, have you tell me your name, why you write about art or want to write about art, and what you hope to learn in this session. So Henry, can you manage that? And thank you very much to Henry and Rachelle for inviting me and managing this.
No worries. I can start to add the participants now as panelists. So this will just take a moment. I think at least on my screen, Fidelia is first. So yeah, if you want to introduce yourself first, and we can just kind of go around.
So tell me your name and why you want to write about art, or why you're writing about art, and then what you would like to learn in this workshop.
Yeah, I'm Fidelia. I'm an artist and currently a PhD candidate in media arts and practice at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, which is on Tongva land. I have a lot of different modes of writing, which is one of the main reasons why I joined this writing mentorship, was to figure out what those different modes are and kind of my relationship to them and how they all fit together. I would say I do a lot of like critical creative artistic writing, as well as the more traditional academic writing. I'm not sure why I write or what that means, but yeah, figuring that out. And then in terms of this workshop, I mean, both of what you outlined sounds relevant and interesting. It seems like if we can touch on both of them, that would be great. But yeah, I'll pass it on to Perry.
That helps.
Oops. Thanks, Fidelia. Hi, David. My name is Hari. My pronouns are he, they, and primarily my mode of expression is writing, although I'm engaging with other forms of expression through this mentorship program. In writing, I tend to write poetry more. So poetry is kind of at the front, and then I'm also experimenting with autofiction, new forms of writing that blends in different genres. Writing for me is kind of connecting to the eternal source or God or infinite or whatever word you choose to call it. The way I kind of say is when I write, it feels like I'm the one that's being written. So there is this kind of connection that I feel when I write, and I'm just like trying to develop that connection further. In terms of what I'm looking to learn from this is honestly, like I'm also an immigrant. I come from India. I actually came to Alberta in 2014 and moved to BC in 2018, 2019. So honestly, I'm trying to find my place in this new world, this new country. The fact that I am an Indian and I see a lot of Indigenous peoples being referred to as Indians, and the Indian status card, there is that intersection there that I'm trying to like navigate in terms of identity and things like that. So I'm just like trying to figure out my place and understanding in the world, and specifically in Canada. So
beautiful, beautiful. I'm looking forward to seeing or reading how you reshape us.
I'll probably pass it on to Janice.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Janice. I'm trying to think of how I can articulate why I write. I don't think I have a profound answer, but I do think that writing is one of the few things that give me clarity and make sense to me. I love that writing, no matter what form of writing I do, I like to write poetry, I like short fiction, I like nonfiction as well. But I feel like no matter what form I'm writing in or what I'm writing for, it always becomes self-referential. And through that, I feel like I'm able to understand other people better. So I think it fosters a deeper sense of empathy in me whenever I do have to write something or whenever I feel like I want to. And that's always been a really nice experience for me in wanting to continue writing. In terms of what I want to learn from this workshop, I think I really echo what Fidelia said, is like, I would love for you to delve into the philosophical aspect and the more structured approach as well. I think personally, I gravitate more to the to the philosophical, but I think as a writer, I realize I need more of that structure. So I'd love to hear both.
Okay, gonna do both. Who's up next?
Oh, I'll pass it on to Kitty.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kitty. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a poet, short story writer, arts reviewer, and student at Simon Fraser University. I study interactive arts and technology with a minor in world literature. Why do I write? I was like trying to take notes of like a bunch of different reasons. I think I write to document my life, figure out my emotions as a coping mechanism and care practice for myself. Why I do art writing in particular is because I love art, and I think I use writing as a way to share this love and try to encourage other people to check it out as well. And it's also like, as a visual artist and like illustrator myself, it's a good way to learn like other artists' practices to inform my own creativity. What I would like to learn today, I'm really interested in learning ways to mess with colonial structures, including like English language, but also like high art gallery spaces and like educational institutions. And so if you have like experience with navigating these spaces and yeah, messing with the coloniality of them, I would love to learn. And I am going to pass it on to Asumi.
Hi, thank you so much again, David. We are really excited to hear your talk. And my name is Asumi, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am originally from Japan. And I am a cultural worker, so I currently work as special project coordinator at Contemporary Art Gallery, Yaletown, Vancouver. And yeah, I predominantly write exhibition reviews and art reviews. I graduated with master's in art history at UBC last year. But actually, why I write about art is a little bit complicated maybe, but in essence, I feel like I really want to leave a responsibility to the people who makes art and who write as well about the important stories. And some of these are underrepresented in the current ecosystem of writing and publishing. So I kind of want to boost that presence. At the same time, I want to be really ethical and responsible to their stories. And that's how I write and why I write. Yeah, and there are so many things I want to learn from this talk, but I'm really genuinely really excited about it. But particularly, maybe I am interested in your process of art writing. I think one of the article you sent to us through Rachelle was, you mentioned you spent 75 hours drafting the piece. And I totally relate. But I really want to hear from you, like how you schedule your writing and how you research, and also how you change your draft, because I can see like you approach from so many different directions, and like your writing is really it shows really multi aspects of the artwork as well as society and context. So I am really interested in like how you brainstorm, I would say, your writing process. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Who hasn't gone yet? I will pass it to Kimberly.
Hi, David. My name is Kimberly. I guess a bit about my background. I spent a lot of years in arts administration, and I guess for me, art writing is a way of merging my writing practice with that experience I've had, because I largely abandoned my writing practice because of my day job. I just didn't have time or energy. So I guess in terms of what I want to learn in this session, I mean, everything you said, I want to learn more about, and also talking more specifically about your idea of critical care. Reading the essay that you wrote for CMAG, I was just thinking about how, you know, Kent Monkman is someone, of course, that I've encountered a lot in life and work. And, you know, thinking about a curator I had worked with who, in the initial like exhibition proposal, basically was told, like, these are all white artists, you need to add other people. And so he added a Kent Monkman piece to it, you know, and thinking about what you said about filling space on the part of settler organizations. So I'd love to talk more about that.
Wow. Whoa, this is gonna be so good. I'm very excited.
I guess Wei-Jin?
Hi. Hi, David. My name is Wei-Jin. I'm a fourth year student at Emily Carr. I'm studying design. Yeah, and I guess I've always been drawn to writing because I find I make more sense that way. Like, talking out loud, things get kind of messy, and yeah, it feels clearer when I write. So that's why I write. And I've always kind of been interested in art. Like, sorry, I'm getting distracted. Yeah, I've always kind of been drawn towards like creative endeavors, I guess. So that's how the art writing kind of naturally emerged. And as far as like what I want to take away from this, I think I want to echo a lot of what Kitty said. Like, this mentorship has been an opportunity for me to like work on my writing, very like dedicate a lot of time to it, like I haven't been able to before. So like I've been venturing into more like experimental forms maybe that I haven't in the past. So yeah, and reading your essay on critical care, I was just like so blown away. And you know, I haven't read that much like art writing, like coming from a design background, but I'm really excited by like these new forms. And yeah, I'm just excited to hear anything from you. Yeah.
Okay. And Bopaz, that we.
Hi, David.
Hi.
My name is Bopa Chai. I am currently the director of Arts Writing Gallery. It's an artist-run center in Vancouver. I moved to New Zealand, from New Zealand in 2012. And I'm about to finish at Arts Week after a tenure of 5 to 6 years. I'm really excited that you could be a guest speaker as part of this series. Why do I write? I think there are many reasons why I write. One of them is to really try and expand my understanding of what art is and can be for many people, and what it can do on a number of different levels, especially for me, a kind of socio-political level. And I also think I just really love this, how succinct that question is. I think for me, writing is, it allows me time to think and articulate through ideas, but not just with ideas, but with people, with communities, also with work in very specific contexts and spaces too. For example, ArtSpeak is located in an area, Gastown, downtown east side, Chinatown, which has really specific, is grounded in different communities in a number of different ways, which are quite contradictory and conflicting. So I think writing allows me to kind of really think through that very specifically in terms of navigating spaces of cities, but also how we speak to people. So really learning, trying to think through different ways of trying to not justify, but speak to different people about what we're doing. And in terms of what I hope to kind of get from this talk, everything that has been mentioned, but also I think I'm also very interested in what you might have to say in terms of like philosophical approaches to writing too. So
okay. Oh, that's everybody, right? Because I'm just ready to go now. Is there anybody else that I missed here? That's it. Okay. So when I was writing, so I can't, I'm glad you read that piece that includes how much time it takes to write. To me, I'm a phenomenally, like unbelievably slow writer. That Kent Monkman piece, I spent about 20 hours just writing the description of the painting and trying to make it as concise as possible. When I get to the model at the end, I'm going to explain why and why it's important to do that. But because you're interested in the philosophical, I am going to read this text. It's not fancy and it falls apart at the end because there's so many rabbit holes that I wanted to pursue. And what I'm hoping is that after I've read this, you can have some questions. And I'm going to do some general comments, and I'm going to favor at one point my position. So I'm in one paragraph, I'm going to articulate my position as an interested critic rather than the notion of disinterestedness. And this comes from bell hooks. Bell hooks is my bellwether. Whenever I get stuck, I always go back to read bell hooks because she and I are temperamentally quite different. So in the person that I'm produced as I read is somewhere between me, my natural habits, and her, and I'm a better person at that moment, which is why you have to write. So I am going to read this thing because it's junior in some ways, but sometimes we have to go back to basics in order to comprehend what our project is. So for instance, there's a knee-jerk reaction to talk about getting rid of hierarchies, which is absolutely nonsense because hierarchies are required, and whatever the new system we're going to displace will have its own hierarchy. And if we're unconscious to that hierarchy, then we are already therefore scripted by that hierarchy. So I'm going to be talking about some of that stuff, but it's not fancy theory. In terms of my research methodology, I have read a lot, I read a lot, but I don't use the academic model of doing a literature review before I write, because then I'm reiterating all the things that came before, and it leaves me less room for my intuitions to turn into really long thoughts. And I don't want to resort to, and all apologies to the there's autoethnography, there's autofiction, there's all these different approaches, which I value greatly, but I'm going to be talking not exactly against them, but art writing as a service, as literally a co-respondence between artists and this writer that I am when I'm writing, and with audiences, so co-respondence. So art writing can be a form of critical care. It hasn't always been. Mainstream modernist art criticism reflected and reinforced the dominant culture's needs, desires, and habits. You may have noticed that before such writings offered their beautiful sentences, well-crafted ideas, and soul-stirring insights, they were premised on colonial, patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist, you get bell hooks in here, heteronormative, ableist ideologies. Did I miss one? This is primarily noticeable in what these critics fail to notice. They were unwilling to admit to their attention certain works of art and certain artists and sometimes whole peoples. My first university art history book featured no female artists at all. So, and some works were not even admissible as art. I come to this later on, but in order to be an arts writer, you have to have a working definition of art. That's the first one. You have to have one written down, swirled away for yourself. You can go to any prof teaching in the art department and they don't have this, but writers can't afford that luxury, right? They're already within all the discourses. And if you don't have a definition of art, and it'll be a complex and it'll be a contradictory one. If you don't have one, then the gray areas will become ever grayer, and you won't. I'll explain it if you ask me later, because I have a very firm one, particularly with Indigenous art. I categorize it in 3 different qualities. And the first one, for instance, being traditional art, is immune to criticism. So critical writing about certain kinds of art would just be a travesty. And I'll explain that why later. Sorry, this is one of those rabbit holes I'll get carried away with. So some works of art were not even admissible as art. Only recently have so-called former ethnographic objects been admitted as art, which means perceived as art, seen as part of a critical discourse beyond its own setting. And when these critics did notice these artworks and artists, they measured them always against white European men and their traditions, and of course found them wanting. To do otherwise would be to undermine the hierarchies, theories, institutions, and practices that made their position in criticism possible. So they have an art definition, and they understand a ranking within that definition, a hierarchy. And then to admit other things in, they have to correspond only with the already preset ideas. So after the Trocadero experience in Paris, with the Cubism, bringing in African art was tentative and took a long time. But to do that upsets everything. And now we're at a point where the dominant narrative is so fractured that there is no dominant definition of art. So they're completely vulnerable to whatever you want to do. But in order to be credible, you've got to come up with a definition. And I don't mean a universal definition. I mean the one that functions, which will determine your attention, the things you're going to attend to and the things that you're not going to attend to. So colonial, patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist, heteronormative, ableist art criticism prefers the judicial and adversarial model of art criticism, wherein the enlightened critic judges an artwork's value against a ranking of masterworks and similar hierarchies. And as you know, faith in such approaches, traditions, and hierarchies has collapsed, and very few serious critics continue to work that way. This loss of faith, this crisis in criticism, has led many writers to hyper-subjective modes, right? So in the absence of something that you have faith in the absence of the convincing master narrative, they retreat to the relative constancy of their own experience. I'm going to say that one again. So in the absence of a convincing master narrative, many writers retreat to the relative constancy of their own experience, right? You're the ultimate master of describing your own process and your own life. And so therefore, often these writers will then resort to that and offer a catalog of their perceptions rather than venturing into something beyond themselves, which is vulnerable to critique. Oops, I jumped ahead here. So this can lead to some great poetry and literature, but makes use of a work of art. This work tends to be a parallel artworks rather than works of criticism. So I'm making not a firm line here because I love when people do this and bring in critical theory as well as their own experiences at testing. But if the self is the only test and you're not bringing in other selves and other points of view, then I wouldn't call it criticism of the sort that I'm favoring today. So critical art writing serves a work of art. Okay? So that to me is a bottom line. It serves a work of art. It attempts to understand the object's project. So I'm emphasizing the object's project, not the artist. The artist is very important, but the object, once it's produced, has its own needs and desires that exceed and are often even unknown to its maker. It's past, so critical art writing serves a work of art. It attempts to understand the object's project, its past, present, and future, its trajectories, its desires. So the critical art writing that I'm interested in is a letter to the artist, an attempt to understand and read the work back to its creator, to offer insights the artist channeled, but might not have been fully aware of. So we heard earlier the idea of a deity channel, that we're channeling for a deity, and then we're trying to understand our own work. That's a good idea, right? Whether it's a religious figure or indigenous in terms of wisdom that comes through nature or whatever, the idea that even in the making, we don't know it. And in the writing about it, we don't know it before we begin. So hypersubjective art writing that uses artwork as a subject to support its own desires does not contribute to art theory and practice. It belongs to another discourse. So I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying that in order to contribute to another discourse, we have to engage it. I don't want to call it objectively, but why not? Literally referring to the object rather than centering the subject. And it's really an oscillation for me between that subjective. And when we get to the model, it'll be very clear, I think. So what is writing critically about art without unconsciously replicating and reinforcing the dominant orders or retreating to subjectivity look like? Okay, so what does art writing or writing critically about art without unconsciously replicating colonialism, for instance, but reinforcing the dominant orders of or retreating to subjectivity look like? How can we manage something in between? Well, it requires that you have and can articulate an alternate worldview. Okay, so that's different from inhabiting a different worldview. The work of this high work of consciousness is that we have to articulate that alternate worldview. Even if it isn't spelled out on our page for the readers, we have it on the side. Readers should be able to see through your words, right? Nice turn of phrase, through your words and also through your words to a non-colonial, non-patriarchal, anti-racist, etc. They should be able to read through your perception and description of this artwork, that this non-colonial, for instance, scaffold that supports your observations, claims, and judgments. In addition, critical art writers participate in art's many discourses and want to contribute and disturb those communities of thought, feeling, sensation, and intuition. So those are my 4 key words today. This isn't just about ideas, it's thought, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And the model will explain how these are quite different, but how they complement each other. And a good piece of critical writing engages thought, feeling, sensation, intuition, and isn't just hobbled by being concerned fully with ethics or fully with thinking. The text also has threads that kind of undermine a sense of completeness. At the very least, you need a working definition of art, an understanding of art's histories and the art world structures and sociologies in order to make informed contributions beyond the expression of opinion. Okay, for me though, as I say, normally when I'm writing academic papers, I don't do a literature review. I mean, I've read some stuff and so on, but I don't give a list of here's what everybody's thinking, because it gives me, I'm doing service to all those other writers, which is important in the academy. But my contribution is going to be so small. And I want to lead with my intuitions. And then I might look for back up, and I'm going to explain this sort of antithetical approach in my interested versus disinterested form of art writing. However, because we're engaged in non-colonial practices, you are not responsible for knowing Western art history, for example. You have to know it, but you don't have to know it, and you don't have to believe it, right? Because Western art history is Christian-based, for example, right? And if you decide that you're not going to learn the saints that are depicted in the Caravaggio or whatever, because it's not germane to your larger project, that is the first level of resistance, right? When people talk about London, you say London, Ontario, you assume that your location is more important than the one they're trying to force down your throat. Okay, so learning the area that you're going to specialize in, it's women artists, it's Bosnian artists, or whatever it is, that's your priority. And the Western canon is not the foil or the text at all. You just start and think otherwise. So for me, Indigenous art is the most important thing. So I did a talk once in, I think it was in Australia or New Zealand, and I said that I believe that the Indigenous way, in terms of how it affects curation in particular in that case, is better, right? So I start with the assumption that this other thing is better than the dominant. And so I don't want to spend so much time on the dominant that isn't serving me and my project as much, okay? Now that is totally disturbing to the system when you pretend or you act as though it's not important, or it genuinely is not important, all the things that everyone else takes in the dominant culture seriously. This will totally disrupt everything altogether, because then when they're coming to, they'll be coming to you because you're the expert in the thing that you know better than anybody else. Okay, I'm not saying don't know Western art history, just don't be overwhelmed by it. All right, so this notion of having this philosophy, history, but particularly definition of art, definition, I use non-colonial, I don't use anti-colonial, decolonial, except when I mean that, I mean non-colonial. And what I mean by non-colonial is all the practices, rather than setting them against a colonial discourse, just all these other practices that are not colonial. And sometimes there will be part of places that are Europe, for instance. Actually, that's a rabbit hole. I almost fell down. That was very close. I'm going to get back to my text. Okay, so here's an important point. Okay. At the same time, you do need an anchor beyond these discourses and apart from your subjectivity if you are to have insights not already prescribed by these entities. Okay, so at the same time, you do need an anchor beyond these discourses, art history discourses, colonial discourses, but also apart from your subjectivity, if you are to have insights not all already prescribed by the entities being the discourses of the Western art world, and also the discourse of your own subjectivity, which will, in both cases, favor confirmation bias, right? So what I'm saying here is you should know something else from a whole other field really well. Innovations of any sort, okay, I'll just give you an exercise. You can't picture in your mind a new thing that is not the combination of two or more previous things. The brain can't do it. Every innovation is based on two or more things that already exist in the world. So if you're caught within a snare of Western thinking and artworks, and then you just apply it to a new thing, the new thing carries all the paradigms and wets and paradigms and tropes from that other thing, right? You need a new thing. So somebody here mentioned about religion. That's really great. Learn a religion, learn all the things of religion, and use that as testing ground against this, or study, what's a good one? Evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, any other discipline, so that you can take your thing, you're writing your sentence and you say, wait a minute, what would my evolutionary psychologist training say about this? And you realize, okay, I'm not being reasonable here. And if I need to allow myself a moment of extra rationality or unreasonableness to that scientific mind, then I do it with intention rather than just a default. Okay, I know this is, each one of these is a little dense and crazy. You can ask me questions later. Okay, so this is the work of several lifetimes, and most of us see our writing as a way of building and coming to consciousness rather than the presentation of perfect understanding. Okay, so absorb that now. I am 60 years old, and it's no easier than when I started, because I keep raising the personal bar for myself or moving it off to the side. Okay, so this is the work of a lifetime. It is a practice, it's not a conclusion. So most of us see our writing as a way of building and coming to consciousness, right? Building consciousness and coming to consciousness rather than the presentation of a perfect understanding. Okay, so you still need these models on the side, but it's there's a good philosopher called Richard Rorty, and I actually wrote about him a little bit in one of my Rung articles, maybe the first one. And he has this really wonderful slender book called I've forgotten it. Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. And contingency allows us to recognize with humility that our knowledge is always limited and it'll always just be displaced by a better idea later on. Contingency, no system's perfect. Irony, contingency is about the temporality of things, but the irony is that we're probably wrong, right? And so the model I'm going to show at the end is a way of trying to compensate for the habitual error that comes from an obsession with our own processes and subjectivity as being the signal contribution. How do we bounce that off? But then my favorite one is solidarity. And I call this nevertheless. Nevertheless, even though we're flawed, even though our system isn't perfect, it's better than the one that we're replacing, right? Because it's serving us, it's serving the people that we are serving. Okay, so Richard Rorty, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity is a nice text, very useful. So in the work, so I'll just read that sentence again. This is the work of several lifetimes, and most of us see our writing as a way of building and coming to consciousness. Okay, coming to consciousness assumes that there's something that we're being conscious of that already exists, but building also suggests that we're building consciousness. We talked about religion from a religious point of view. The great thinker Carl Jung argues that we are the mirror held up to God's face, right? That we were brought into being because God could not critique himself, could not see himself, could not critique himself. So it seems a little over the top, but in order to write successfully, you have to have an enormous ego. And by that, I mean, you have to have an inflated sense of yourself, right? Even to do this thing is like crazy. It's not as stupid as making art, but pretty darn close to it. But the idea is that you are actually reflecting something that exists that couldn't see itself, right? That correspondence with the writer or with the artist, but also that you're building something. You're building a model. It's not a replication of the real world necessarily, but it's helping you understand it from your point of view. It's not a universalist position. And so that's my last point in this paragraph. At the very least, all of you writers here, the way we are now is no longer modernist people. At the very least, we no longer pretend to having access to a universal position. Okay, it's always not just filtered through our own subjectivity, it's constructed by our subjectivity to serve subjects like us. Okay, so here's my paragraph I decided a little while ago to try and clarify my position. And there should be things preceding it, but this is it in a nutshell. So I begin by understanding that I am a Métis critical writer. Okay, Métis, critical, and a writer. I love the English language. I can't say writer, critical, Métis, right? The language already constructs the order, and I might show you something later on that just knocked my socks off. Okay, so I'm a Métis critical writer. To drop the Indigenous prefix, so to take out Métis, to simply call myself a critical writer would imply an objectivity I don't sustain. Okay, critical writers are what modernists might have called themselves, or critics even. By throwing Métis, it says that I'm already interested. Okay, so that's a declaration I make right off the top. And so now I'm no longer responsible for the white European Western tradition that is of objective critical writers, or people trying to imagine they have a Platonic view and can rank things with great confidence. I am interested, not a disinterested critic. So the best essay on this is Bell Hook's Altars of Sacrifice. Just the first 3 pages are enough to sustain you for years. But Altars of Sacrifice, she's talking about Michelle Basquiat, but she talks about, there's wonderful things. So she talks about how his works for white critics are like fences or like walls, and only people with the right keys can open those gates, right? And so what does that mean? That's a challenge to us. But she also says that when we're moved by a work of art, it's because we're born to another place, right? It's a spiritual experience, and the struggle is to bring it into words. But we're moved first, right? We're moved first. So we're interested rather than disinterested. So interested criticism reads the present as foreshadowing a future the author can abide. Interested criticism reads the present. So I'm reading this object, this work of art, its context, but I'm reading it as foreshadowing a future the author can abide. Okay, so what I mean by that, this is really dense in here. I could turn this into a whole essay. But what I'm saying is that the artist is making an essay or an assay. They're making a statement they're not even fully conscious of. And like Duchamp says, it's the viewer and the artist who co-create this new thing, right? But the idea is that it's foreshadowing a future the author can abide. Okay? So I'm writing this thing into a certain kind of being towards this ideal being, which is a non-colonial human being. In one case, you can throw in all kinds of other adjectives to what this will be. So writing critically while Indigenous means calling out colonialism and nudging readers towards co-producing non-colonial tomorrows. Okay, so that's my way of being a bit more specific. So just bear with me. I'll read those 2 sentences again. It's pretty much at the core. Interested criticism reads the present as foreshadowing a future the author can abide. Writing critically while Indigenous, right? I'm not pretending to be a European person. I'm not professional. Writing critically while Indigenous means calling out colonialism and nudging readers towards co-producing non-colonial tomorrows. If I spend my time totally working the colonialism, I'm abetting it. I call it working in the irony mine, right? I don't want to be the mirror. I don't want to be holding up a mirror to colonialism all the time. I really want to focus on non-colonial possibilities, which is non-colonial tomorrows. So interested criticism can be chided for confirmation bias, looking for evidence to support your beliefs and refusing contrary facts. which is only a problem if your beliefs are mistaken, only an obstacle if you claim to describe reality neutrally rather than openly desire to shape it creatively. My critical art writing is speculative nonfiction, creative critical inquiry that attempts to influence the future reception of past and present things and offer theoretical support for the yet to be made. So when I see a great work of art that I don't quite understand, I make it my mission to understand it as best I can as something addressed to me, not some kind of universal explanation, something addressed to me that I am going to correspond with to the object and then incidentally to the artist, because I want to make them aware of the potential or the meanings that they are currently not aware of. So there's my ego. I'm assuming they don't know what they're doing, and I'm usually right. So literally, I should have said at the beginning, you know, like I co-founded Artichoke magazine in 1989, which was between Calgary and Vancouver. And I write a fair bit of, used to write a lot of catalog essays and then regular criticism. Now mostly I'm doing, I guess, kind of, well, I write for Rung, but mostly chapters and books and stuff like that. But especially when I'm writing a criticism, I send those essays to the artist, especially the catalogs. And often people are amazed that I'm understanding what their project is, but also that I understand something, or I'm purporting to understand something that they don't quite know, because I want to influence what they're going to make. If there's no criticism, things remain the same. So traditional art is immune to criticism, Indigenous art, or customary art, or most craft. There's no need for criticism, and it doesn't invite it, it doesn't request it. Rod Sayers, who's a Tjahyana artist, maybe like 25 years ago when I was teaching at the Alberta College of Art and Design, he's about to graduate, he's a jeweler. He brings us a couple of trusted profs into a room, and he says, here's my jewelry from my time here. This work over here, I really want your criticism about. And this other work here is customary work, and I'm not interested in what you have to say. You like it, dislike it, it's irrelevant to me, because it absolutely, those objects already know what it is, where it belongs, where it's going. It's non-critical work. We don't criticize that work. We don't engage it critically. You can do it personally, you can do whatever you want, but it's not going to contribute to the discourse of that area, right? They're totally immune. Children's art, it can be therapeutic, but it's not art in the sense of a critical form that it invites criticism. There's all kinds of artworks that are exhausted. Landscape painting. No one writes critically about landscape painting until a breakthrough happens, and then you do, right? All kinds of things are non-critical forms. They don't attract critical attention. And if we do, we might be doing it for our own reasons. This becomes very complicated in curation of Indigenous things that are not part of the art world discourse. And it does often violence to those people who are traditional and suddenly thrust in. I'm down a rabbit hole again. So let me go forward a bit. Okay, so I want to read that last sentence again, because it's pretty much every sentence is a position for me here. But my critical art writing is speculative nonfiction, creative critical inquiry that attempts to influence the future reception of past and present things and offer theoretical support for the yet to be made. Okay, one little thing I'll say, this is in opposition to capitalism, right? My Indigenous colleagues will make stuff to make money. That's really important. When their work becomes critical is when they're doing it for theoretical reasons, nation building, articulation of matriarchal legacies and ways of being, any Indigenous knowledge that they want to pass on, that they're not selling, right? So we all need a theoretical support for the yet to be made. And if they read that, then they'll say, oh, that's possible. I didn't know that's possible. That's why artists go to art shows. I didn't know that was possible. I didn't know that was, we're increasing our repertoire. Okay, as I say, this essay will peter out, but I'm going to keep going. Each of our key terms, art, writing, critical, and care, if they are to mean anything, must refer to specific things or actions and exclude other things or actions that are not themselves. Calling one object art, for example, means some other things are not art, and that you know what that difference is, and you can explain that, why something's not in the gallery, why it's not suitable for criticism, why it would do violence to include it in the gallery or do critical writing about it. Similarly, not everything is writing. A salmon is not writing. To call a salmon writing is to misunderstand salmon and writing, or to force a metaphor. Take a moment, you perverse poets. Your writerly minds are trying to contradict my claim, trying to make a salmon writing and writing salmon. So not everything is writing, and not all writing is critical. Care too is only perceptible by our knowing its lack. Care too is only perceptible by knowing its lack. This is an obvious but significant observation. It's the basis of hierarchies and narratives that organize our thinking, sensing, feeling, and most of our intuitions. For example, not all works of art attract our attention. Fewer still inspire us to write about them. This range of desire, from intense enough to act to leave the ease of semi-consciousness for the pain of critical writing, all the way to a complete lack of desire even to look at the thing. All of that is an expression of our own personal hierarchy of attention and desire. A great struggle for artists and critical writers is to understand how much of this drive and its expression is socially constructed, and what sliver emerges and is controlled by themselves. Critical, and by self, I mean that's position between the ego and the object, that moment of writing, not just an expression, understanding of yourself. Critical art writing is the sharpening of that sliver and its insertion in the locations where it will do the most good. Okay, I gotta go on an aside here. One of the greatest shocks of my life was the first time I went to Australia, I think 13 or 14 years ago. I was part of an Indigenous collective of curators. There were 6 or 7 of us, went down there for a good length of time. And the first group we met with, they said, we need you to meet our elders and we got to sit in a circle. And we did, we sat in a circle, we met the elders. And within 5 minutes, I could have been back home. They were talking about their versions of Indian residential schools. They're talking about their version of the 60s scoop, of the loss of language, of territory. It was uncanny, but it shouldn't have been. And then what I think we were realizing is, oh my God, what we are countenancing as Indigenous turns out to be a reaction against colonialism or formation within colonialism. And it's a thing, one of the sets of things that the Indigenous folks there and here share in common is their construction within this British colonial structure. And so much of my time of the last 13, 14 years is trying to tease out those things that are Indigenous, that are not in simple reaction against that. It's very hard to do. So each of our key terms, art, writing, critical, and care, indicate a special form of attention. Baked into their usage is the assumption that some things and doings are more worthy of attention than others, and that it is possible to rank these needs and qualities. Okay, that looks very much like what the European critics were doing. Okay, but now you are constructing your personal, or hopefully eventually a collective model of things that are worthy of attention, but also a means of ranking them. Not by excellence necessarily, that might be a measure, right? Need might be another. So what what's the meaning and need and use of an artwork in the downtown East Side? I go to Gallery Gachet to find out, right? That space or any of your spaces develops over time in community. And so its understanding of art makes sense in that space. You transport that to the Vancouver Art Gallery and you realize that you're in two different discourses. So how do we remake the Vancouver Art Gallery, if that's our choice and the particular stone we want to roll up the mountain? I don't think it's worthwhile most of the times, but if you chose to do that, and you're not just in a critical mode in the sense of criticizing their structure, but displacing it, you have to do the heavy lifting of being able to articulate that theoretical scaffolding that will hold your project together, but also understand your personal desires, right? That cause you to rank qualities of care. And I would call that triage, right? Someone in need of care. Actually, I'm jumping ahead of myself here. So for example, some folks are clearly in need of a specific kind of care, more in need of a specific kind of care than others, right? We have a hierarchy, we have triage. We can talk about the quality of care, not only according to some established standard, but also according to the experience of the cared and the undercared. And this is a hierarchy. So as writers, before we even write, we have to establish what we care about and what's a personal need, personal care, or a care for the communities that we're writing to and for and with, rather than some kind of other, I'm setting up the European critic as a fall person, but they don't even really exist anymore. They have ceded the territory more or less to writers like you already because their dominant mode has been totally exhausted. So some thinkers have argued against hierarchies, figuring them as the source of all evil, but whatever they want to replace it with, it'll be a hierarchy. But if we understand these hierarchies properly, we see them, so we're talking about social hierarchies here. So social hierarchies are what I think of as fixed fluids. That is, the rankings shift, but the ranks endure. The rankings shift, but the ranks endure. The idea of ranks endure. The king is dead, long live the king, right? The individual thing is displaced, but a new thing isn't there. But do they have to be kings at all? No, but there'll still be a structure, levels of care, levels of need, levels of expertise, levels of knowledge. We have elders in our community. I go to them for certain things and not to other things. So it's not like a pyramid set of hierarchies. It's just the knowledge that some things are less known than other things to certain people, as an example. So objects that attract the attention of the art world changes. That some things are attended to over other things remains. So we are in the midst of a slow collapse of that aspect of modernism whose hierarchy placed white heterosexual men at the top. Okay, so this is the thing, when I was writing yesterday, I was blown away. So notice how the English language requires me to rank men at the end of the sentence, even though I wanted to express the hierarchy and in its ranked order, men, heterosexual, white. So the general rule in English governing adjective rankings position the controlling noun at the end, in this case, men, at the end of the sentence, and all those aspects qualifying it, and they rank according to, first is attitude, right? So a certain kind of quality or judgment, I mean, size, shape, condition, age, color, pattern, origin, material, and purpose. And if you mix up the order, you will be reprimanded by editors and readers alike. So men here is the controlling noun, and all other identities are rendered qualifiers of that source. So you could talk about a black gay man, but not a man black gay, right? So see how the language already makes it these prior conditions into adjectives that qualify that central being. It's just so crazy. Okay. So writers don't write so much as they were already in writing. So we had the example, the fellow was talking about religion as being a conduit, or I wouldn't even call it religion, spirituality, or an actual connection with a deity. And when we get to the model, I'll explain that further. So writers don't write so much as they are already in writing. They are already seized by grammar, by genre, styles, tropes, plots, regional idioms, expressions and expectations like character arcs, artificial binaries like antagonists and protagonists. If you don't have these things, writing seems illegible and not pleasing. If you follow them completely, then you have mere journalism. If you've ever done journalism, you're fitting people, characters into these character arcs. You have to have change, you have, all these things. Writing against those tropes is very difficult, but that's what we need to do at the moment. We can't take on all of them, but we can take on a number of them. Otherwise, it will be illegible. Writers are also already shaped by their teachers, their fellow writers, living and dead, by editors, publishers, by real and imagined audiences. So much writing, like the figure in Michelangelo's marbles, are already waiting there to be revealed. That's from one point of view. What feels like invention is usually reiteration. It is this truth that makes AI journalism possible and AI fiction abysmal. Mere writing, like mere art and mere care, are non-critical in that they're primarily driven by established tropes, right? So if you think of a patient going into care, everything's set up not for that person, but for that unit, as though they don't have other complexities. And how do we open that up and change, make care radical, is something that is a good analogy for writing. How do we make writing radical? Writing's not radical until it's noticed as being radical. So what are the conventions we break? For reason, not for entertainment alone. Okay, I just see so much here. I'm gonna leave it there because I just realized it's already 12:24. That's crazy. So I want to take about 10 minutes if there's any questions you'd like me to follow up and deepen before I go on to this practical model. There might have been a phrase there that you need me to unpack. So as you can tell, I've developed this system over so many years. I think I can answer any question, but I love getting difficult questions because it allows me to rethink my model and how I can include certain things or whatever. I think you can follow me. Anything stand out that you want me to address before we go on to the big model? Don't be shy. Build the discourse with me. Rachelle.
Yeah, I'll open the floor to any of our participants, as well as any of the guests who are attending outside of the panelists. Yeah, feel free also to type in your questions in the chat.
Well, I can go into this model, and then if there's time at the end, I'd be happy to take questions. Okay, so now we're going to do the heavy lifting. So you've probably seen medicine wheels before, and they are racist. You probably noticed. They refer to Black people, and if you go into elders' teachings, or I wouldn't consider anybody who uses this model an elder, they're a certain kind of colonial knowledge keeper. So they refer to Black people and what their qualities are, and so-called yellow people and what their qualities are, and white people what their qualities are, and red people. But no Indigenous person thinks of themselves as red. And I don't know about if you guys see yourself as yellow or anything. It's totally, I tried to trace back where the model comes from. I can't find a location prior to the late 60s. And if you look at census data, at the turn of the century, people had to declare whether they were Black, white, yellow, or red. Okay, anyways, it's a total racist thing, so I don't use it. But this is kind of like it. But where it really comes from is Carl Jung, I mentioned earlier, and Myers-Briggs, and psychological type. Now, I understand the type thing. I raised on it. It's all great. I'm going to just use a very simple model without going into all the details. If this was a week-long workshop, I would. I do use it for my grad students, but I'm going to show you a model. You're going to draw it on a piece of paper, and then I'm going to explain only how it works with writing, how I use this tool for writing. Okay, so you're going to draw a circle and put an X in the middle, and it'll look like that. Okay, so you're going to make a circle and make a line through just roughly. And then the top axis, you're going to write the word thinking. The bottom axis, you're going to write the word feeling. The axis over here, you're going to write sensing, and intuition on the other side. And then I'm going to explain roughly what the model is. I don't want you to look up Jung or Myers-Briggs at the moment. If you want to deepen it, you can. This is just to help us organize our thoughts and how I write an essay. Not always, but how the model that helps keep me off my baser instincts, just following from my subjective point of view. Okay, so I'm going to assume you've got this on a piece of paper in front of you, and then I'm just going to walk through it. I had a curator come to my grad students last term, and I explained that I was doing basically this kind of exercise. And she said, oh God, make sure they describe the work. Okay, so they're writing a review, or they're writing about their own work. They're writing their thesis support paper. Describe the work. Okay, so this is the sensing part. Okay, and what she's saying there is so true. Most artists are intuitive artists, as I'll explain in a little bit. And the hardest thing they have to deal with is things as they are, because they don't believe things are as they are. They're interested in how they might be, right? You're making art, okay? So the way we take sensing, that word there for our purposes, just refers to information that comes from our senses. The physically present, the factual, actual, and real, okay? So often when people go to write, they're already thinking about the ideas and this is going to be non-colonial or anti-racist or whatever it's going to be. But I call it being humble before the object. I assume that there is great wisdom in the thing that I'm going to be reviewing, that I'm going to be writing about, that I'm going to be contemplating. Something drew me to it. That's the intuitive side we're going to cover in a minute. Okay, something drew me to it. My desire meets the desire or the answers expressed in the object. That's my article of faith. Something drew me in there. It might be platonically some higher perfect being, and I'm drawn to it for its own intrinsic qualities. It's not just a subjective thing. I'm a better person for being in its presence, however you want to see it. But we start with the sense data. So as I said, I spent more than 20 hours just describing that Kent Monkman painting. And what astounded me is I saw things that I assumed were happening because it fit what I wanted to say about the piece. But by being humble before the object, collecting the facts. Martin Luther King Jr., letter to Birmingham jail. And before I can take righteous action, I must collect the facts. Okay. So you will always be led by an intuition. That's fine. You have an agenda. That's what brought you to this work in the first place. But humble yourself before the object, collect the facts. Okay. So this is a secular materialistic point of view, and it must have a complement. So you go across the wheel, and we've got the word intuition. Intuition in this case, right? I'm not talking about Myers-Briggs, just in the case of this model, refers to insights that come without the usual logical processing, right? So it's a jump to a conclusion. You have an insight, you have a feeling. That's not the right word necessarily, but you have this intuition. That is a complement to the sense data, right? So the sense data is just about what's there. It can't get the spiritual aspect of it. So this complements the metaphysical, is complementing the material, these two things, okay? Now, we have to sort this stuff out though, because most intuitions are simply recall. most intuitions, the aha is confirmation bias, something that was stored in us and comes out. Racism is intuition of this sort. Oh, I see that person, I jump to a conclusion without talking to them. Okay, so intuition isn't always innocent. Similarly, sense data, we know from evolutionary biology, by perceptual psychology, that sensing already is organizing. Our senses already organize the data before it even enters into consciousness. So these things are arranged. So, but this model leaves room open for revealed truth, spiritual information, however you want. But the form it takes is it's a leap to a conclusion without logical steps. You just have this feeling. You are moved, as Bell Hooks says. Now, these forms are just information until we organize them. So the next axis is thinking and feeling, and it's how we organize the information. So sense data, that's pretty straightforward, the physically present, right? Not some future thing. What's there right now in front of me, present, factual, actual, and real. Intuition are patterns and possibilities, or conclusions, if you really believe them strongly. And of course, for the most part, they do derive from sense data, but also, I'm arguing here, also can be from senses or from sources beyond the senses. When we're organizing the data, those two approaches are thinking, which is evaluating the sense and intuitive information through logic by applying objective principles and prioritizing impersonal facts. Okay, so evaluating sense and intuitive data or information through logic, right, some kind of apparatus, and applying objective principles and prioritizing impersonal facts. This, therefore that kind of thinking. Okay, how does this information I've got fit in with Western art history? How might it deviate? How do I account for that deviation? All of that kind of thinking. And we can hopefully open that up a little bit before I run out of time. Going down to the other part, it's feeling. And I want to separate feeling from emotions. Emotions really are a form of intuition or sense, physical sense. When you're overwhelmed by emotion. It's something that happens to you haptically or physically, or in the case of depression, which also might have a physical manifestation, it can be an ennui, which is more like an intuitive thing, right? The notion of this thing just being there and you can't make sense of it. Okay, so emotions happen to you. You can register them with increased heart rate and sweating and all that. That's different. Feeling in this model, in this context, refers to a way of evaluating this information. Okay, so the sense data and the intuitive data come in, and then you make sense of it. And your main model is how it affects people. No discussion of care is possible without people and this notion of feeling. And that's where the triage comes in. Data comes in and we assess it logically, makes sense, all our historical training or theoretical training, whatever. But then at the end of the day, if I'm going to write this, how is it going to affect people, positively or negatively? I was in the hospital in Surrey for 3 weeks there, and every morning they had to jab me with this blood thinner. It hurt. I hated it, but it was a form of care. Right? They knew logically that they had to do this way. And depending on the affective maturity of each person, some would take great care. They'd pinch my skin first, then they'd stick it in. It wouldn't hurt as much. They would talk to me to distract, whatever. There are certain models of care that require you to inflict pain. Art criticism might be top of that list. All right, so how do we put this in action? Like I say, I can really do a whole semester on this, and I just want to help you out. All right. My own intuition is that most of you people begin with intuitions. right? You have an idea, something attracts you to this object, something attracts you that you're going to sit down and write about it. And it's important to acknowledge that. And so what you have to do first is go through your, you have to do a personal assessment. How much of this is that I want to project what I already know and I've already done it automatically onto this thing? And how much am I understanding this thing or this person as a new thing that I can't comprehend yet? Okay. But I have a sense that my time will be spent well. And it's not just because they're good looking or they're intelligent or whatever. There's something there more than just the recall. Okay. So doing a personal assessment, why am I writing this thing? What is this intuition, a personal projection, or is there something more here? Am I going to get knowledge from this or whatever? Am I going to be, is this an opportunity for care or whatever your priority is? So we already talked earlier about establishing your own hierarchy of, which is not the same one as the Western or the normal critical art writer. Is this going to do harm? Would come up for the feeling. Okay. But I prioritize at the beginning the senses, because it's the thing, if you're an intuitive thinker or intuitive feeler or whatever you are, sensing tends to be neglected. If you go to art schools, this is the ceramics and the sculptors. This is their realm, right? They don't like theorizing, Derrida and all that. That's the injection that they're supposed to get to make them do better, but they don't believe it because, and they might be right. Okay. So sensing is the here and the now, things as they are, present, factual, actual, and real. So you humble yourself before the object by hopefully being before a real thing, sculpture, painting, performance, dance, theater, whatever. And you're collecting the information. You're collecting the facts. I can't believe it. I'm writing an anthropological article right now about a performance that I was in Vancouver at an anthropology conference. And I had distinct memories of what it was like. And then someone had shot it on their cell phone and I was wrong. And I was wrong in a way that served my interests. I could not believe it. And I'm writing, I have to change this whole article to reflect this idea. Something happened in the performance that I totally blanked out on because it didn't serve my agenda. Including it in there meant that the anthropologists are watching saw something different. And it's amazing to me. So spending way too much time just writing descriptions of the object is important, and not relying on the literature review. Okay, most writers are profoundly lazy when it comes to this humility, and they go to what everybody else said about this thing. You sit there, and I have my grad students do this, some of my fourth year, if they're able. Sometimes I make them sit for hours in the room contemplating that pot that they made until they understand what it is, what it wants of you, and what it wants, how it wants to generate itself for the artist, how it wants to generate its offspring, right? Figuring out what that is. So it's a way you acknowledge the projections, you acknowledge the templates you're applying to things, but you're trying to take that object seriously as a form of knowledge, and you're trying to then articulate it. There are many times when I was writing regular criticism for newspapers and that, or Border Crossings or whatever the magazine, where I had one impression. I sat down in this slow way, wrote just to describe all the things where I changed my mind. I liked it better. I couldn't, it would have been unethical for me to continue with the way I was writing about it. Okay, so for example, I don't like non-objective painting and sculpture. I think it's immoral, right? I can explain my reasons, and then I'm in front of this piece and I'm crying. I can't stop myself. How do I write that? And so suddenly this structure that was against non-objective work because it doesn't engage the social, for instance, or it imposes itself in the social, like Richard Serra's titled Tilted Arc or whatever it is, or it's created by immoral men who can't be brought to a cult, whatever it is. Sometimes in the humility before the object, my mind changes. Okay, so suspending your thinking and feeling and just collecting the data first from your intuition if that's your default position, but something you have to force yourself as a form of will is to write about the thing that's actually there. So that's the sensing. Okay, only then, you'll jump ahead, you can't help yourself, but only then you bring in the evaluation, okay? Because you have to understand what the thing is in order to find out the right level of care to offer it. So if somebody is working within a tradition, you have to have some competency in that tradition, right? Or you shouldn't be writing about it. So that's thinking. Where does this belong, right? What is it? Where does it belong? What's its histories that informed its making? What's the innovations, knowing that background that it's making? How is it going against all of that? So when I was a younger writer, I just did the top stuff there. I did that stuff. My preference is for this and this, and then I struggle to do this. I force myself to that, and I think I'm doing really well. Then I'd publish something, and somebody would be devastated by my critique. Devastated. If I was shooting up, maybe that's a good thing. But if I was shooting across or down, maybe that was a bad thing. Okay, so the feeling part is, how is this going to affect people? How is this good for people or any good for people? And if the withering criticism is important, to let them know that they're being led down, their form of indigeneity is informed by Christian error or something, yeah. So I wrote a piece in Border Crossings called "On Not Walking with Our Sisters," where Rebecca Belmore refused to put on a ribbon dress and smudge because she saw the ribbon dress particularly as a form of colonialism. And it opened up, not just that, but it's opened up a big debate, and there's quite a division in the Indigenous community about whether a ribbon dress, for example, is part of Indigenous tradition or not. But what it means, Rebecca Belmore is a non-metaphysical artist, so she says. I once was at a party with her, and she said she doesn't believe in all that stuff. Indigenous spirituality, metaphysics. She walks away. Okay, we've been drinking. She comes back later and she pulls me aside and tells me this dream she had. It's just like, holy shit. So whether she knows it or not, the metaphysical stuff is channeling through here directly to her work. But she doesn't want to be controlled by the elders and the spiritual keepers of the tradition that she's part of, right? She wants to be open to Buddhism and other things. So feeling part is an objective, I'm using that word here, and you can argue with me later. It's an objective account because you are working through the object rather than the subject, okay? So when you're in that mode, you are feeling these things, right? You're understanding them, but when you're in the evaluative mode, not the emotional mode, you are trying to understand what this thing means for people, rather than just what it might mean within a system that a thinking type might do. Okay, I'm trying to keep this short and leave some room for messages, for questions. So when you're writing, go through your past writing. How many times did I talk about how it smelled, right? Whether it was warm or chilly, right? How I felt when I was in those spaces. I mean, the sense data. How is it that, for instance, if you're working with certain kind of artists, they really do emphasize the touch, right? If you move down the ontological scale from the high art to low, suddenly people are touching stuff. What does that mean? When we're inverting and challenging, I work with Carmen Papalia, who's a non-visual learner, he calls himself. I call him a non-visual artist. He has me describe, we did a workshop for 3-4 days in Banff one time, huge group, and he wants me to describe everything to him, right? He doesn't get the feeling of the room the way I do through my eyes, so I got to explain it. And in explaining it, I'm suddenly aware of things that I was missing, people who are disenfranchised, and it's the description that allowed me to understand that, Okay, so if that's your weakness, that's the muscle you want to work on more now. All the senses and the pleasures and the pains that are required, that are brought up by that, rather than defaulting to your preference of jumping to patterns and future possibilities and so on. It's also a way of grounding it so we understand that this thing, this object, is an entity that has desires of us and can only be completed with us as writers or as sensitive reviewers. But sensitive audiences, they don't go anywhere near the depth that a writer does, or people talking about a work. So I did this big bridge project in Edmonton, took like 3 years, and there's 566 paintings, and they're great. When I read all the stuff people write about it, they don't even scratch the surface. So I bring elders, or I will be bringing elders. After I broke my legs, I was supposed to go there, and the elders are going to come out with me, and they're going to explain the stories. Okay, and there, that's just the facts. This is about this, this is about that. And then if you press them or ask them, they might tell you the meaning or the implications or what it means, but it just balloons in meaning and volume. Okay, so what I'm asking you to consider is, just when you do your writing, either in the process you follow this methodology, but certainly at the end, these are people who I prefer thinking and intuition. You might be feeling intuition. These are, how come we're leaving these people out, right? How is it that we engage not only the sense needs of ourselves, but also of others? Okay. As you can see in curation, the sense that was disenfranchised in the past is coming back. You know, there are certain museums that allow you to touch and so on. That's why, this is another rabbit hole, the most progressive work is happening actually in the art galleries education departments, which has always addressed all four of these things, because they're working with children. They're working with people who aren't just developing the muscle of the thinking and intuition, or intuition and feeling. And so they have to go all the way around the circle. So the test of a good quality piece of writing is, yes, it's going to default or going to build from your strengths, but how can you address all these folks here? Okay, why don't we leave it there? Please ask me some questions so that I can deepen this.
If no one has any questions, I think I'm gonna go first. Thank you so much, David. It's really deep, and yeah, there's so many questions I have. I don't know how I can form it, but what you mentioned about education's department in the museum really intrigues me, because my understanding from my experience working in the museum is like some of the museums really foreground that, but some of the museums like prefer not to foreground that because of the issues about the interpretation, I think. Because certain museums, like, I mean, all of the museums have interpretations that they prefer or they prioritize over others. And
I'll just interrupt for 1 second. So
yeah.
there's two modes and two schools of thought. One is, yeah, that they're passing on, that they're replete with knowledge, and then they're going to pass it on to you, which is more that modernist model. But then it's swung the other way, which they call the questioning model, which is wonderful, but it doesn't describe narratives that might be more valuable than other narratives. And so there are narratives that went through the questioning model that might be valorizing your position, but you should also be exposed to narratives that exclude you, right? That challenge you. And that's what I talk about always. That moment of writing, that moment of reading is a space between you and the author, you and the artist. And that's why we read, we're so entranced, because we're not quite ourselves at that moment. And of course we can go, depending on how far we can go. The questioning model is great. It opens things up, but there's no conclusions. And contingency, irony, and solidarity. We need to be comfortable with inconclusive conclusions, but at least it offers us something to stand on. But it's not saying, well, the author says this and therefore that's the case. I did an exhibition with Michelle LaVallee, and we brought in So we had curatorial authority and we wrote in text. We had the artists all write their large panels, like full essays sometimes, explaining their work. And then we hired 3 Indigenous story keepers, we called them, who interviewed residential school survivors and the artists who were still living. And then they were the bodies in the spaces. You had a question, you just twitched your eyebrow, they would go over there and engage you. But they didn't want to say that your opinion about an Indian residential school survivor's experience, that your opinion is as valid as their experience. That would be violence, right? So anyways, this is just a reaction at the moment, the questioning methodology. How do we come up with something in between? It's the same problem I've been discussing with writing. And I cut you off. I'm sorry, I just get so excited. Asumi, where were you going with that?
No, I actually lost my thought, but that was really good.
Right.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, I think my question was, yeah, maybe you touched upon it actually, but just.
I'm really sorry that I derailed.
No, I'm excited too. No, I would say, how do you reconcile yourself, like while you're working in the institution, that the reality of like some of the interpretation has to be foregrounded because of the sake of the institutions and like art museums, and that sometimes, like just like you said, sometimes like certain people invited for certain purposes to talk about something, but like once that person is gone, then the space is just, that's my
Well,
question.
that's not bad either, because if we understand these institutions as space of that they're not institutions, they're buildings and they're people and they're policies, right? And the policies are the project of the ancestors to control their future progeny. If you go into those institutions, use the word reconciliation, punch in reconciliation in David Garneau, and you will see that reconciliation assumes that the parties were in a harmonious relationship and something broke them apart. Listen to yourself. You have to reconcile with the institution, right? For me, I use the word conciliation. I'm coming to the institution. Here's the institution. How are we going to come to an agreement before I work with you? Yes, I'm going to have to give something up. My most recent little essay in Wrong is about collaboration. Collaboration is the meeting of 2 people as if they were equals to disturb each other and their policies and processes and so on. When we bring Indigenous people to this institution, we bring them for show and tell. That's the first step. Fine, do it. You bring somebody in, you're going to represent all of Black culture for the Surrey Art Gallery, for whatever the place is. And I know Cecily was on here earlier. And so you have it's already built in, and you're just offered space rather than the opportunity to transform the space. Okay, so the idea is you're not reconciling the space. Of course, you'll have to reconcile with certain things. In order to come to agreement, you'll have to accept and live with things that you don't necessarily agree with in order to go for a larger project. But you have to come into the institution with the project in mind, rather than just responding to what they're going to offer you. That's really hard. But that's why I'm saying, prior to writing, you have to do this spade work. Prior to being in the institution, unless you're just going to be a cog in it, or you're going to be sand in the cog, in order to survive, in order to be careful in that space, you have to articulate to them what you need of the space and how you plan to transform it. Very hard work, very hard work, very, very hard work, because it requires you to take a position rather than just accept the position that's been afforded you. Very hard work. Anything you do that is an advance, I applaud you. Anything above surviving, that is. It's very hard work. And we could be specific. If anybody has an example, I can walk you through. As a curator, I will never be an institutionalized curator. When I am a curator, I come in with a project and I come in with demands. in order to have this incredible, the ego thing again, this is I don't speak this way, but in order to have, because we're all writers here, I have this idea, this vision in my mind of how this incredible project's going to be, and I'm going to convince you, and then if you want this thing, here's what I need. Not just money, not just space, care. What's the care you're going to afford me? Anything, okay, so I wrote about this in terms of trying to articulate ableism. The system, all of our systems, colonial systems, are based on efficiency. That is the religion. Any deviation from the norms that are anticipated by the system are considered to be something they accommodate, right? Whereas you bring your difference in and you want that difference not only celebrated, but to transform the discourse of the institution, that's going to take more time and more resources and more care. And so you have to tell them that ahead of time. So I told them, I need these 3 people, these story keepers. It's going to cost $30,000. How do you're good at this. How are you going to get that for me? And they said, that's great. We've never applied for this grant before. We're going to do it. But I have to do the heavy lifting ahead of time to know that that was essential for the good of this project, the good of the people that I would be working with. So it's that kind of work ahead of time, rather than assuming that the default systems are the right systems. Assume they're wrong. That's the thinking. The critical thinker assumes that the system is wrong, right? The feeling type person assumes that it's wrong for people. When you put these 2 qualities together, especially if you have a team, it's unstoppable. When you have agreement, okay, conciliation. As you can see, I get really excited. I don't want to take up all the time, but other pressing issues. Oh, I see a hand up.
Hi, David. That's me. Thank you so much for this enlightening talk. Really taking a lot from it. My question is actually quite similar to someone who, Belinda, who wrote something in the chat, but specifically it's to do with my kind of like internal struggles in engaging with non-colonization or decolonization or that concept. So my writing tends to kind of engage with these materials in a way that it's kind of a response, right? Yeah. But at the same time, there is this growing awareness or this feeling of not fear, but it's like, I don't want to respond. I want to move on is kind of where I'm coming from. So in a way that, like, when I engage with such material, I wonder, am I just kind of still enslaved to the system in the sense that I am again responding to whatever the past is? Is there any kind of advice you'd have to kind of like move beyond that or transcend that talk beyond just a response to something and kind of like breaking through to something new?
Yeah, I mean, I would want to see the particular case, right? But here's what I do as a mental exercise. I try to imagine actual persons who could not be accommodated by the institution that I want to enter. Okay, so first thing, they're orientated, we're all speaking English. The first time we went to these places to meet Indigenous people, we went to Australia and New Zealand, former colonies. And so of course we got along. We were all composed in the same way. And then I ended up going for, it was a different thing, but not that long ago to Dhaka. And their form of Indigenous was similar, but really, really different. Okay, so I imagine what would it take for those hill track people to come into, say, the Vancouver Art Gallery? They can't do it. They can't just walk in and do their art. It's not possible, right? So I think of, are you a transitionary figure? Are you trying to be something that belongs there or belongs to the public? It's a public institution. Then I imagine, what does it take? How do I bring that way of being, those people, that artwork, without doing violence to them in that space? So my practical thing is I work with Indigenous artists. So there's certain literal protocols that I have to do with the very objects that I'm dealing with, as well as the people. But still there will be Indigenous people who will not go to those spaces and shouldn't go to those spaces. They're not for them. And so I talk about sovereign Indigenous display territories that are separate from. They're not meant to be there. That's why I think it's very important for you to understand when you're building your hierarchy or your model or whatever it is, that you understand that there are limits. Not everything can be contained by this notion of art or by writing or criticality and even by care. And you humble yourself before that, and then you figure out what you can do, and it can be very specific. And that's why I say what looks like a small thing can turn out to be an incredible innovation, right? The mere fact, I mean, I remember the Arts Writing Centre of the 1980s, you know, there were almost no women artists showing. And when this thing called the precursor of primary colors, I don't know if you know of that collective, it was called, oh shoot, now I forgot what it was. Anyways, it was the early 90s. And what they did is they just did the thing at, Panchayat is part of it. Anyways, Minkwon Panchayat, and this gathering of Indigenous, Black, and other color artists in Calgary at the Chinese Cultural Center. And because the big debate had been, well, there just isn't enough, these artists don't exist, and if they do exist, they don't have quality. And so what the programmers did is they had a different artist go up on the stage every 10 or 15 minutes, show their work, do the dance, do the whatever. And I had colleagues from the gallery, the white galleries beside me saying, okay, we get it, just stop. There was just so much. And so sometimes that mere presence is enough to start this sparking the thing. But then if it's just one person, you don't have the care. So I'd have to hear the particular instance. But again, understanding the desire you have and the desire the objects you have care for have, and whether they should be in those spaces under the conditions that exist or not, is central to this notion of care. I want to give another anecdote because this is transformative for me from Indigenous point of view. I was brought up to another little delegation, went to see the Sami people in northern Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And I was with one of my colleagues who's a Yorta woman, Kimberly Mouton, curator from Australia. And she was talking about earlier in the year being depressed. She had gone to Germany and seeing some Yorta artifacts in German museums. And she goes back to her elders and explained how she was feeling horrible, right? Had this intuition, right? She should feel horrible. She feels horrible, trying to understand it. And they said, well, what are you talking about? Those are our ambassadors. We don't want them repatriated. Those are ambassadors. These objects were made and sent to these locations so that subsequent generations of Indigenous curators would go there and have sovereign territory. That site where it is, only they could go. Blew my mind, right? So from the Indigenous point of view, this sensing thing is not casual at all. I have to know the nature of that object. Was this object an object that needs to be repatriated? Is this an object that's an ambassador that's doing work, allowing me to be in sites that I couldn't otherwise be? What is this thing doing? So many people want to bring cultural things into the high art space, and it does violence to their nature as a cultural thing. And so they'll do it because it has aesthetic qualities or it rhymes with contemporary art pieces. And if you imagine doing that with a human being who is attached to that object, it does violence. And I've seen this, in fact, when you brought these Indigenous people who made these beatings or fish traps or whatever, and they brought into the high art gallery, they're a fish out of water. You didn't make them comfortable. You didn't make it home. Anyways, very complex. This is the cutting edge of other than traditional curatorial practice. Anyone else with a thought or a question?
Thank you, David. I just want to address a couple questions that we had in the chat as well. So first we had Belinda Harrow, who says, great talk, David. I think you have just addressed this in a way, but is it possible? What are the problems, pitfalls, and issues with non-Indigenous writers and artists attempting to create, or parentheses, write, reflecting a non-colonial world perspective? I guess I'm asking if you think that a person who comes from a settler culture is able to disconnect from colonial perspective in their writing or art.
Yeah, so that's so multi-level, right? So the default position is for those people to report, right? Just record what the artist says, report, write it down. That's fine. That's not a bad thing to do. It's better if the person themselves writes it, because the reporter is writing for what they perceive as the needs of the institution. So a certain kind of grammar and so on, all sorts of things, but it composes people for the space. Of course, as I've mentioned earlier, any composition is a composition between the person, the actual person, and the object or the text or whatever. There's something, we're transformed. We compose ourselves differently for the text is what I'm saying. Some people, I remember the first show is in as an Indigenous artist where they did video testimonials, so we wouldn't be translated or find ourselves so constricted by writing. It was brilliant. I loved that. So again, same as what it's saying, the non-Indigenous scribe has to decide what they're narrating. If they're narrating the writer, the artist, why are they the person doing that, right? And they're likely to reinscribe the colonial perspective, whether it's because you're going to do it in English or you're going to make it palatable for what you think the audience is, all those things, you're making so many decisions. So enabling the maker to do it is probably a great idea. But also, if you do have a lot of competency within the area you're describing, then for sure, there are tons of non-Indigenous art historians and ethnographers who do a job way better than I would because they actually understand the field intensely. But so Ruth Phillips is an absolute genius. So she started this group, or she's part of this group called the Great Lakes. Oh God, I can't remember. But anyways, it's all the institutions, museums, and universities around the Great Lakes who have Indigenous holdings. You go to their website and you have an ethnographic description, that has, like the object in it. And those objects are usually in the museums shown just in one point of view, right? Well, the objects in their site have multiple points of view. So they're designed, the websites are designed for makers rather than for ethnographers. So then you see the bottom of a basket. So someone looking at that who wants to make it, they'll see how it's made, that sort of origin point. But then you go to the side and there's 3 old ladies with gloves on, touching the object and describing and discussing it. And rather than just condense it down to the facts, all their feelings about it and speculations and intuitions, all the things around the wheel are covered. And then there's a transcription below. Brilliant. And that's the future of the archive. There'll be a conference on this in Toronto in October, I think, Indigenous Archives. But the notion is, again, following that rule, is it's going to take longer, take more resources, and more and different kinds of care. Any of this work has to do all of those things. Assuming as soon as you follow into the trap of efficiency, then you are going to compromise the essential aspects of difference. That has to be built into your grant writing too. Also the notion, well, the deviation from contingency, irony, and solidarity. Actually, it isn't a deviation, is the notion of solidarity. The notion of these alliances we make over time and not just the occasion of the project is really important. I'm working on a project that's called Cultivating Keen out there in Vancouver, though it's all virtual. I'm supposed to be out there right now. And that's what we're working on. So there's a big grant that was accorded to this group. David Heng is managing it. And we spent about a year trying to reimagine the granting. So think of what it takes for an individual to write a grant, right? It excludes most people right away, right? So how do we enable those people who are not invited in? So what we decided is that we started with art elders, or art aunties, we call them. And so people who are in the field, they don't have really that much more to prove. And they then choose their mentees rather than mentees applying. And then both are enabled to work together for a period of time. And of course, those things that's this moment project. Hopefully they'll carry on before, but they could also have chosen mentees that existed a relationship before that time. Okay? But the notion is not composing ourselves to come up with a project, writing ourselves into a future that we can't maintain because we don't know who we are at that point. So it has to be fluid. All the reporting has to be fluid. Anyways, that's just a way of thinking through these systems differently.
Thank you for sharing that. I just wanted to share these last two questions, and hopefully we can aim to wrap up by around 12:20 so we don't go too much over time. But I think these last two questions can be kind of paired together, since they are asking about, if you could elaborate on these models of care. And so I'll kind of say the first one first. By Lorna Brown. Thanks so much, David. I especially appreciate these insights and that intuition is often recall and is not innocent, and that models of care necessarily involve pain. Can you talk further about these points? And the latter question by Magnolia is, hi everyone, thank you for all your careful conversations. If there's time, I'm wondering if you might speak, David, as a writer to the role of care in relationship with your readers, and also how that is connected to your work as an artist as well. So particularly on those relations of care, or how that is mediated.
I don't want to talk about my relation as an artist. It's just too confusing and too much. Just as a writer for the time being. Really good questions. Okay, so the first one following our hierarchy is the notion of attention. Writing is attention. So by saying I'm going to write about somebody or actually doing the writing, I'm attending to them. What I do is I try to locate whether I meet them in person or not. Oh, I mentioned before, when I first started off, I just did this part. And now I really try to attend to this part as well. And sometimes it means that I temper this aspect. So I can be very cutting and wounding. But when I'm in my final edits and say, what do I intend by this cutting remark? How do I want this to affect this person? So that sliver that I'm fine tuning, am I making into a stabbing tool, or is it acupuncture? Or am I using to lift something out that needs to be prized out? So sometimes I will cause discomfort because I'm sharing a truth. And consciousness is painful. That's why we don't do it that often, right? And so let me go back to the model. If I were just to describe the thing you made, and I spent 1,000 words just describing it and offered no judgment, that would be a huge level of care. So, but think of what people do caring. They ask you to describe how you're feeling. They don't evaluate it yet. That's for later. They just ask the questions to get it out. We do the same thing with the object, or the thing with the object and the person, because our project at the very beginning is to understand the object, what its needs are, what its desire is, including, or it can include the artist, right? Before making a judgment. Okay, but some people will stop there. And for me as a critical writer, that's not enough. Okay, so now putting it within a context can cause harm, or I wouldn't call it harm, I'd call it pain. So if I say, well, this work looks an awful lot like somebody else's work. A lot of artists who believe that they're being unique and that unique is something to be prioritized, that makes pain. But suddenly you realize that they've got a hierarchy where uniqueness is important, whereas it need not be necessarily in this case. Or I make the observation, this is like this other work, however, it's doing this other thing or whatever. So it's so complex with care. When I was writing about Kent Monkman, I knew he was going to unfriend me on Facebook. I knew he was never going to talk to me again. When I was a critic before, I was an artist, but I was not showing work in Calgary throughout all of the 90s because I pissed off every single artist and their dealers. So when I enter into that field, I'm in trouble. With the Indigenous, I'm in trouble. So I have to pick my fights very carefully. So there isn't a word in that essay that isn't thought through, an idea that isn't thought through, a fact that isn't double checked. So those are all levels of care. However, as a person who prefers thinking over feeling, I am going to wound because I think that it's going to, or I should say, I only wound or I only challenge if I think I can make something better. But I have to have a better in my mind, and I have to be able to articulate it. That's why I was emphasizing all that structural stuff at the beginning. I have to have an other worldview, a better worldview. Otherwise, why am I writing about that thing? Whereas before, when I was just immature, I was just picking fights with certain things that I intuited as being wrong or a symptom of a bad thing and all that. And that's all good, but it's not constructive in the end. I want people to read that article on Kent Monkman and, well, what happened with Kent Monkman, then he came up with that horrible piece that followed that fell into almost every single trap, and then things that I didn't think of. The one with Justin Trudeau having his ass spanked and the women implicated in his violence and all that. It's like, holy shit, he missed the boat on this one. But it was already anticipated in that prior article, that essay. So that's the thing is, I mean, if I go back to the phrasing I was saying, I want to change how things are perceived, and I want to provide the theoretical framework for new things that have yet to be produced.
Thank you so much, David.
I know I didn't get all the stuff in there, but hopefully that helps. Yeah, Henry, yeah.
Thank you so much. I was gonna just ask because it's such, the art community is quite small, and then, you know, and sometimes, for example, I guess to be frank, like as myself, I write sometimes, and then I guess it's kind of like what you said, is like pick your fights, like whether, because well, before you said the earlier part, I was gonna say, you know, if you got any sort of backlashes from people who you wrote about critically, and then they're not happy, and then they come back to you, and then blah blah blah. So kind of like how to balance that. I guess my question was to sort of like navigate through that, because I guess sometimes, well, I guess for someone working in an institution like myself, and you know, I'm not, well, I think that there is like a certain role and responsibility for me to take on as the head of the organization, but also I guess that, you know, personally, independently, as someone who writes about art, I definitely there are things that I just, should I say this kind of thing? Yeah.
But what I would say is there used to be a position, and some of them still exist, called critics, right? And they were seemingly independent from all these things until their biography comes out and you see how implicated they were. But that position doesn't quite exist anymore in Canada, you know, free full-time critics. So that's why I used, and I've always used, critical art writer, because a critical art writer, for me, is implicated in all kinds of other forms of writing and criticism. And I'm a prof, and I'm a curator, and I do all this other things so that I'm part of a community, right? And so how is it that elders critique people? They will not, don't do that. Indigenous elders I'm talking about, don't do that. I mean, sometimes, you know, if you're about to do something foolish and get hurt, but they tell a story, right? And it's a story that is both general and then very specific to you and what you just did. And then if it wasn't heard, then they repeat the story, you know, maybe with different characters. And critical art writing does a lot of that. And so, I mean, all of you have been around enough, if you've been in the art world for more than 3 years, to see a shift. And the shift that's happening right now is, because I'm older, is absolutely profound and truly has been unpredictable. And the way I see it, or I've described it in another location, is you think of a government, and the government in waiting has a shadow cabinet. I'm aware of all these PhDs of color, Black, Indigenous PhDs, almost in the Indigenous side, they're almost all women, that are getting their degrees, and they're the shadow cabinet that are going to displace all of this stuff. But even all this stuff is already decaying and falling away, right? In this city that I'm in Regina, of all places, the head of the Mackenzie, the main art gallery, Indigenous. The head of the Dunlop Art Gallery, she's Black. The head of the film pool, she's Black. I mean, just the physical thing has changes, but they don't just come in as Black and Indigenous people, but with all these new contemporary ideologies that are wrestling with tradition and wrestling with contemporaneity and wrestling with the existing institutions and rethinking them utterly. That's what's happening. That's what's going to happen. And so anybody who's writing is creating the theoretical framework for those people to make this thing possible.
Thank you so much. And I guess I would just also extend a little bit. Sorry, David, this is so amazing. So I really want to take some time to do that, but let's, conscious of time, but let's wrap it soon. But I was gonna just say that, you know, how do you see sort of, I guess, artists' works, I guess, works by racialized artists, or let's say the BIPOC artists that really make work to cater to this status quo or a certain status quo of white supremacy, but also cater to this kind of like, oh, this is multiculturalism, and also how their works are, they were very, I guess the artists are also like consciously aware of that their work are going to be utilized as this kind of like I guess sort of the poster child of certain agenda, institutional agenda, and then they sort of intentionally play into that. So kind of want to see, I think that there are some of the ideas that discussed in the Kim piece that are really valid, true, and relevant, but I just kind of, how do you see that? Because I do think that these days in contemporary art in Canada, there have been a lot of these I have observed is that, okay, I have to play into this, let's say, specifically, let's say Asian diaspora, what is it about? And then there's this kind of stereotypical cultural symbols that sort of just repeating over and over again, and does not really produce anything new, but also just kind of there serve as certain kind of motif. I don't know, maybe that's very frank, but
it's the same, it's the exact same problem in writing as in art, and I addressed it or just like teased it when I talked about the notion of legibility. Okay, so if you reiterate the tropes, you know, whether you're making a movie or writing a novel or a poem or whatever, poems not so much, but if you use all the understood tropes, either, well, in the form, the content, the character, the subject matter, it'll be legible and it'll be boring. So you have to change up at least something in the form, content, or subject matter in order to keep visual interest. But if you go if you go further, then things become illegible to certain types of people. And the people who are already puzzling through those problems, they're so excited because you made an innovation, right? That's just the way it works. The first position, so I have a model, as I mentioned before, for Indigenous art. So there's the traditional art that is made for Indigenous communities, by Indigenous communities, and sometimes they're gifted away, but they belong to their own discourse. Their discourse is regulated. Nobody can have an opinion about it that disturbs that thing. The next level, or the next type, not really a hierarchy, is Aboriginal art. Most Indigenous people are making Aboriginal art, which are made within Western materials and modes. Very few people escape that to make Indigenous contemporary art. It's so difficult, but people do. So Kent Monkman, in order to be legible, has to give white Western folks everything that they're used to, and then this twist, right? And that makes, when you do that, that's the cutting edge thing within the dominant. Within the dominant Indigenous intellectual, it's absorbed and understood in 3 weeks. And then if he doesn't up the game, then he's a mainstream artist. He's not contributing to Indigenous conceptual thinking. Now, I love Kent Monkman, and his stuff lasts more than 3 weeks for me, you know, especially when you look at the film and the performances and everything. He's incredible. However, he's not going to motivate me forward as an artist or as a thinker at this point. Yeah, maybe he will. But that's why we have many artists. You know, Rebecca Belmore does continuously shock and amaze. Think of what she's doing with her installations that are, she's rethinking the way we've been rethinking as Indigenous people, monuments and the notion of public art by making things that'll fall apart. That's huge. That's huge. Other people have done it, but not in the same way when she's been asked to memorialize and she's refusing that, or others. So that has to be written about, because otherwise people don't know what's the significance of it, right? So these innovations and consciousness, whether she's conscious or not, but I'm sure she is, need to be described. Her career, nobody could write that career. There's no richer Indigenous art career than hers. And it's been written about pretty well, but nowhere near where it needs to be if she was a New York artist or something. So anyways, yes. So the main problem, both in critical writing and in art, is if you're so radical, at a certain point, you'll disappear because you can't be legible. If you think of the movie Contact with Jodie Foster, I haven't seen it for years, but she gets to this place and she gets an inkling of what the aliens are like, but the aliens can't show them as they are because it would friggin' blow her mind, right? If you haven't been in the art world for a while and suddenly you go to Venice or whatever, or a great gallery, and your mind is blown, but some people will walk in there and feel like they went to the storage locker or something because they don't have the precedents that lead them to see the innovation. So that's the writer's job as well. There's so much. But the thing is, living with compromise is a requirement of all these positions. But when you're boring yourself and your audience, then you need to find ways of innovating. And as I've hinted, you have to have a second thing that's outside of your discourse community in order to make that third new thing. And so if you're just playing within your own tropes, then you're making Aboriginal art or you're making conventional, traditional art. You need something outside. So you see all these Indigenous artists doing crazy things like with Star Wars things. I can't stand half of it. And then you see it go to it and think, oh, but that's pretty freaking clever. And then you realize that those original Star Wars creators were using Joseph Campbell and Indigenous metaphors anyway. So they're reclaiming them. I forgot his name. He's a Haida artist doing that. But that stuff's great. But in order to understand it, to contemplate, we have to write about it. And there's not enough writers. And certainly those who are, most of them are stuck within the academic tradition, or they're stuck within solipsism. We need these places in between where writing is service and care. So as you see, I'm very excited about this stuff. I'm so glad to have an audience of intelligent people who are actually going to enact this problem of critical writing and curation and teaching. So it's been a pleasure to be here. I hope I can meet you guys sometimes one-on-one so we can have more of a dialogue than a monologue, though.
Yeah, let's do another panel. I'm so down to do that. And then there's so much to talk about. I'm so excited, and it's yeah. And then it's only midday, and it's like just so many things in my mind I want to talk about. Definitely, I guess I just have a note to sort of like wrap it up. Is definitely just relevant to what we just talked about. Is that I'm constantly worried about sort of the sort of why institutions defining Asian Canadian art, the idea of Asian Canadian art, and how to how there are only certain types of work accepted and categorized under certain this idea into the museums and big institutions, and then canonized as the Asian Canadian art. Actually, there's a lot of these happened, and then and definitely I think that we see this the spraying of Asian Canadian art, arts and culture sort of in the 90s, and then it was the peak of sort of the race politics, but also after that there's seemingly just like there's a wide range of practices and ideas that are really that kind of like evolved from that point. But I'm constantly worried that how we only see that through this kind of more historical context, and oftentimes these works are demonstration of traumas, and then it's just kind of, it's so worrisome to me for just like, I don't want to go to the museum and then finally an artist a project, a major project by a Canadian artist of Asian descent, it's a display of trauma. We want to see something else, and then we want to have more acceptance in terms of what other people are doing as well. So there's always that, and I guess that's also something for ourselves as an organization, a center as well, is that, you know, is this framework that, you know, is a new team, it's a, I'm the new head, and then we have a new staff, new board, and how we inherited this framework, and then how we can work with that and also work through it. I guess it's not really a question, it's just
no, but
something.
The question we ask ourselves is, how are we unconscious agents of the colonial state or the racist state or the heteronormative or whatever the thing is? And we are. And that the work you're describing is what I called earlier working in the irony mind. So we know this is a trope, but it's in order for us to have presence in this space, we're going to use it, but we're using it playfully. We don't really believe this, whatever. And that's Aboriginal art, right? It's this placeholder, this growing pains moment. And then artists will pop up here and there that'll just totally outclass all of that. Just outclasses it all. So for me, Indigenous artists who come on the scene now and they speak their language, outclass me, I'm done, right? And they get to use the knowledge and the theories that come from Cree or whatever to support their claims that are completely outside of the colonial construct. There's parallels and so on. It's not, I want to be careful about constructing indigeneity or anything as in opposition to Western Enlightenment norms of logic and so on. I can talk about that forever. But the notion that we can construct something where the powers and be look at and say, well, that is a complete thing. I can't even interpret it. It is itself. So when you're bringing even the notion of Asian, that is a colonial construct still, right? That's how you're corralled. And so you say Asian, I hear you say Indian. And then I go from Indian down to First Nations, Inuit and Métis. And then I go down to the various First Nations and the communities, right? And the Métis collectives or whatever. And so already entering into the notion of Asian is colonial. That's a problem. That's a mistake. It's an obvious error, right? Is that really what brings you together? And not a certain kind of desire to transform the world rather than just represent our culture that's been not recognized before? You know, we're past that for sure. What does Asian mean? It doesn't mean anything, right? So what are the terms now we can use that have meaning? Anyways, that's being presumptuous. I don't know.
I think it's totally valid. There's ongoing concern for organizations like Century. It's just really, I think that, you know, the organization was also created in sort of this well, I guess against the backdrop of like very specific policies like multiculturalism, and also this kind of like need to reach out across the Asia Pacific, and also and how to sort of engage with the local communities on the West Coast. I mean, specifically Vancouver. So there are different things, but I think that I guess what to me is so important to how to critically look at these frameworks and these connections, and how what we can make something new out of it, and then also critically examine it.
And that's a key, and that relational shift from objects standing alone and people who are receiving them and all that, the notion of the relationship, that's really key, you know. And that's one way around the terms like Asian or Aboriginal that made objects of folks. Indigenous, I mean, I articulate this in larger essays, but Indigenous is that reference to people who are not only connecting with their own cultures and locations and land, but also interconnecting with other Indigenous folks around the world who have been similarly constructed and similarly have relations to land. So maybe there's a term, a diaspora covers some of that, right? The notion, because it qualifies people that are in relation and emphasizes on mobility and displacement, and there are different ways. but yeah, what an exciting time. Everybody feels the thrill, right? Everyone feels the thrill of possibility. It's so exciting, and things are actually materially happening. That's why I was very pessimistic even, well, I'd say 10 years ago for sure, but not now. I'm excited.
So on that note, thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you so much, David, for this super engaging, super wonderful, I don't know what words I could say, as remarkable as Rebecca.
Thanks for this opportunity. I can't tell you what it means as an Indigenous person, as a Métis person, to make these connections. I don't speak to the dominant white institutions and folks that much anymore. Mostly I'm working with Black and Asian, but mostly Indigenous and Métis communities. But I really appreciate this. There's a lot of futures that we share as well as past. But it's really only with this sort of mutual allyship that we're going to overturn all of this. But then the challenge is, what's the next chapter? How do we get along in the future when we're really controlling the narratives and play? It's very, very challenging and hard work. But thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity.
Thank you so much, David, and looking forward to all these amazing reimagined futures. For sure. And just one last note. Please subscribe to Century's newsletter if you're interested. There is like a link, not for David, just for our other attendees.
So I will.
And then follow us on social media if you're. We're quite active on our socials. Yeah, and the Century's Speaker Series 2022 continues. Next up, we will have. Sorry, Rachelle, could you quickly remind me, sort of like throughout the summer and August and September?
Yeah, I think we'll have Renee Saragini-Saklakar coming up next. It won't be as part of the mentorship specifically, but she'll be speaking in August next month.
And please stay tuned for a lot more conversations, and I hope everybody can join. It's really what I really appreciate the most about today is definitely this time we could take time to discuss and then to exchange ideas, and also to hear one another, because that's not always we don't always have the luxury to really slow down to be so specific. So anyway, have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are, or night. Thank you again, David. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, and wishing you well in your recovery.
Thank you.
All right.